At Christmas, I was working a double shift in the emergency room. My parents and my sister told my 13-year-old son there was no room for him at the family table. They made him ride his bike home alone in a freezing blizzard to spend Christmas Eve in an empty house. I did not make a scene, I took action. The next morning, my parents found a red envelope taped to their front door and started screaming. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who treated your child like a burden. My name is Desiree. I am 34 years old. I was on hour 14 of a brutal holiday double shift. The emergency room was a chaotic blur of flashing lights, rushing gurneys, and the endless hum of heart monitors. Christmas Eve always brought in the worst cases. I was standing at the nurse's station rubbing my aching temples and charting a patient's vitals when my cell phone vibrated in my scrub pocket. I normally ignore personal calls on shift, but the custom ringtone told me it was Jamal. My 13-year-old son never called me while I was working unless it was an absolute emergency. I stepped into a supply closet to answer. The moment I held the phone to my ear, I heard the howling wind. It was 20 degrees outside with a brutal winter storm warning in effect. Then I heard his voice shaking so hard his teeth were literally chattering. "Mom, I am biking home." My heart stopped. The supply closet suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. I gripped the metal shelving rack. "What do you mean you are biking home, Jamal? You are supposed to be at your grandparents' house for the Christmas Eve dinner." His breath hitched over the line. A heavy truck roared past him, splashing slush into the audio. Grandma said Trevor and his parents showed up early. They needed my chair at the dining table. Aunt Bianca told me I had to leave because my sweater did not match the color scheme, and I was ruining the aesthetic for her holiday photos. She said I eat too much anyway. A cold, absolute rage paralyzed my vocal cords. My parents, Calvin and Brenda, were hosting their annual lavish holiday dinner for the prominent members of their church. My father was a highly respected deacon in our African American community. Public image was his religion. My sister Bianca, 32 years old and chronically unemployed, was his golden child. She lived entirely off our parents' credit cards while maintaining a lifestyle that rivaled a reality television star. Trevor was her white husband, a man who called himself a tech entrepreneur, but spent most of his time golfing and dropping condescending microaggressions about my single mother status. "Are you telling me they kicked you out of the house in a blizzard, Jamal?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Grandma told me to bike back to our apartment," Jamal said, his voice breaking. He was trying so hard to be brave. "She said it builds character." "I am almost at our street, Mom. I am just really cold." "Keep pedaling, baby. Go straight inside and lock the door. I am leaving right now." I hung up the phone. I did not cry. I did not scream. I walked straight out of the supply closet and marched to the charge nurse. I told her I was leaving. I did not ask for permission. I grabbed my coat and walked out the sliding glass doors into the freezing snow. The drive to my apartment was a blur of flashing traffic lights and blinding snow. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel. As the heater in my Honda Civic blasted hot air against my frozen fingers, my mind raced with a sickening realization. 2 days ago, my mother Brenda had called me crying about how tight money was this year. She claimed they could not afford the massive prime rib roast, the imported seafood, and the expensive side dishes for the church guests and Trevor's wealthy parents. Because I always played the role of the dutiful daughter trying to buy my way into their affection, I transferred $800 to her account without hesitation. I paid for the very meal they were currently eating. I bought the food sitting on the table where they told my son there was no room for him. They had happily taken my money to fund their elaborate society dinner, but tossed my child out into a lethal winter storm so Trevor and his pretentious parents could sit comfortably. My parents had always worshipped Trevor. They treated him like royalty simply because he wore expensive suits and threw around tech buzzwords. Just last week, my father Calvin had proudly co-signed a brand new BMW lease for Trevor as an early Christmas gift. Meanwhile, when I asked my father to lend me $500 to fix the broken heater in my apartment, he gave me a 20-minute lecture on financial responsibility and told me I needed to learn how to stand on my own 2 feet. I parked my car on the slushy street and sprinted up the stairs to my apartment. I pushed the door open to find a house that was barely warmer than the outside air. The broken heater had finally given out completely. The living room was dark. I found Jamal sitting at the small kitchen table. He was still wearing his heavy winter coat, his hat, and his gloves. He was eating a bowl of dry generic cereal because we had run out of milk that morning. His shoulders were slumped. The vibrant, smart 13-year-old boy I had raised looked completely defeated. I walked over and pulled him into a tight embrace. His jacket was soaked through with freezing rain. His cheeks were bright red and his fingers felt like ice. "I am so sorry, Jamal," I whispered, kissing the top of his head. "I am so incredibly sorry." "It is okay, Mom," he said softly, resting his head against my chest. "I know Aunt Bianca does not like me. I know Grandma and Grandpa care more about looking good for Trevor's family. I just did not want to ruin your shift." His maturity broke my heart. A child should never have to be the bigger person when dealing with adults. I helped him out of his wet clothes and wrapped him in 2 thick blankets. I boiled water on the stove to make him hot tea and sat with him until his shivering finally stopped. I tucked him into my bed, where it was slightly warmer, and promised him that things were going to change. Once Jamal was fast asleep, I walked into the living room. The physical cold of the apartment perfectly matched the temperature of my blood. Any other daughter might have picked up the phone. Any other sister might have called Bianca to scream and curse. I did not do any of that. Screaming implies a loss of control. I was entirely in control. I sat down at my small desk and opened my laptop. I pulled up my financial records. For years I had played the struggling single mother and the exhausted emergency room nurse. It was the perfect cover. My family saw my worn-out scrubs and my modest car and assumed I was barely scraping by. They used my perceived poverty to justify treating me like the family scapegoat. They had absolutely no idea who I really was. I opened a secure, encrypted folder on my desktop. The screen illuminated the logo of Apex Medical Staffing. It was a private healthcare logistics empire that I had built from nothing over the past 8 years. I controlled the nursing and physician staffing contracts for 40% of the hospitals in the state. I was the anonymous founder and chief executive officer. My net worth was sitting at roughly $30 million. I kept my wealth a total secret to protect Jamal from my family's insatiable greed. I continued working clinical shifts in the emergency room because I genuinely loved saving lives. But tonight, my family had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I typed up a formal legal document. It was a cease of financial support and medical insurance coverage notice. For the past 4 years, I had been quietly paying the out-of-pocket costs for my father's highly expensive premium heart medication through a blind trust. I also covered my mother's premium dental insurance. They assumed it was a perk from a church charity program because I had arranged it that way to spare Calvin's fragile ego. I hit print. I watched the printer spit out the crisp white paper. I folded the document and slid it into a bright red envelope. I wanted it to stand out. I wanted it to look like a warning. I grabbed my car keys and walked back out into the blizzard. The drive to my parents' neighborhood took 30 minutes. They lived in an exclusive gated community. The houses here were massive stone and brick mansions with sweeping driveways and manicured lawns hidden beneath the snow. I pulled up to my parents' 6-bedroom estate. Every window was blazing with warm golden light. I could see the silhouettes of people mingling in the grand dining room. I saw Trevor holding a glass of wine, throwing his head back in laughter. I saw Bianca wearing a glittering cocktail dress posing for photos by the massive 12-foot Christmas tree. I saw my mother bringing out the roast I had paid for. They looked like a perfect advertisement for holiday joy. I walked up the long, curving driveway. The snow crunched softly under my boots. I marched straight up the sweeping stone steps to the massive mahogany front door. I pulled a roll of heavy packing tape from my pocket. I taped the bright red envelope directly to the center of their door, right over my mother's expensive imported holiday wreath. I did not knock. I did not ring the bell. I simply turned around and walked back to my car. As I drove away, the image of my son eating cold cereal in a freezing apartment burned in my mind. The days of me seeking their approval were officially over. The days of protecting them from their own financial incompetence were done. I returned to my apartment and curled up in bed beside my sleeping son. For the first time in my life, I slept peacefully on Christmas Eve. The anxiety that usually plagued me regarding my family had completely vanished. It was replaced by a cold, calculated readiness. The next morning, at exactly 7 o'clock, my cell phone began to vibrate violently against the nightstand. I reached out and looked at the screen. It was my mother, Brenda. I did not answer. I let it go to voicemail. The phone rang again, then a third time. Finally, a voicemail notification popped up. I hit play and held the speaker to my ear. My mother's voice echoed through the small bedroom, shrill and absolutely hysterical. "What the hell is this legal notice on my door, Desiree?" she screamed over the line. "What is this garbage about our medical insurance being cut off? You better answer this phone right now before your father has a heart attack." I deleted the voicemail, tossed my phone aside, and pulled the blankets tighter around Jamal. The game had officially begun. The alert on my phone was a simple banner notification, but it struck me with the force of a physical blow. A withdrawal of $45,000 had just been processed from Jamal's college savings account. I stood in my freezing living room, staring at the glowing screen while the numbers burned themselves into my memory. That account was a joint custodial fund set up 13 years ago when I was a young single mother, working double shifts just to keep the lights on. Because of my age and lack of credit history at the time, my mother Brenda had insisted on being a co-signer. I had spent over a decade pouring every spare dollar, every holiday bonus, and every overtime paycheck into that account so my son would never have to struggle the way I did. Now the balance was zero. I did not scream or throw my phone. The burning rage that had consumed me on Christmas Eve hardened into something much more dangerous. It was a cold, absolute clarity. I grabbed my winter coat and my car keys. I checked on Jamal, who was still sleeping soundly under a mountain of blankets. I locked the deadbolt behind me and ran down the stairs to the parking lot. The roads were slick with dirty slush, but I pushed my old Honda Civic as fast as it could safely go. I drove straight to the premier downtown branch of my bank. I knew exactly who had taken the money, and I knew she would not do it online. My mother preferred the performance of wealth too much to handle large transactions digitally. She liked to walk into the bank and be treated like royalty. The bank lobby was warm and smelled of expensive coffee. Holiday music played softly from hidden speakers. I spotted her immediately. Brenda was standing at the premier banking counter wearing a pristine white cashmere coat that probably cost more than my first car. Her designer handbag rested on the marble counter. She was smiling warmly at the teller, chatting with effortless charm as she signed a stack of transfer documents with a gold pen. She looked like the perfect wealthy matriarch without a care in the world. I walked up right beside her. The teller looked up and offered a polite smile, but my mother did not turn around right away. She assumed I was just another customer waiting in line. "Cancel that transfer," I said. My voice was quiet, but it carried clearly through the hushed lobby. My mother jumped and spun around. Her eyes widened in shock for a fraction of a second before her face smoothed back into her familiar mask of maternal condescension. "Desiree, what on earth are you doing here?" she asked, adjusting her silk scarf. "You look terrible. You really should not come into a nice place like this, wearing those old medical scrubs." I looked down at the transfer slip sitting on the marble counter. The receiving account was a corporate LLC registered to Trevor. "Put the money back, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. Brenda let out a soft, practiced laugh and waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, please do not be so dramatic, Desiree. I am just borrowing it. Trevor needs this capital immediately. He has a crucial meeting with an anonymous angel investor next week, and he needs to rent a luxury yacht to host them properly. You know how these high society tech deals work. You have to look the part to get the part. Trevor is our ticket to real money, and we have to support him." I stared at her in absolute disbelief. She had stolen my son's entire future so her unemployed white son-in-law could rent a boat to impress a stranger. She genuinely believed this was an acceptable reason to drain 13 years of my blood, sweat, and tears. Once Trevor secures his bridge funding, we will pay you back with interest. She continued, her tone dripping with false sweetness. You can always pick up a few extra night shifts at the emergency room to build the account back up. Jamal is only 13. He does not need college tuition money tomorrow. You are making a huge deal out of nothing. The sheer audacity took my breath away. They did not just view me as the family scapegoat. They viewed my trauma and my physical labor as a personal funding source for their delusions of grandeur. They thought I was nothing more than a workhorse designed to carry the weight of their fake wealthy lifestyle. I turned my attention to the bank teller who was watching our exchange with wide, uncomfortable eyes. My name is Desiree Adams, I said, pulling my driver's license from my scrub pocket and placing it on the counter. I am the primary owner of that account. I am halting this transfer immediately. The teller looked nervously between me and my mother. The transfer has already been initiated, but it is still pending in our system. I can stop it if you authorize the cancellation right now. Cancel it, I said. Brenda grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully through my jacket. Desiree, you stop this nonsense right now, she hissed. Her sweet facade vanished entirely, replaced by pure venom. Your father will be furious with you. Trevor is bringing generational wealth to this family. You are going to ruin everything because you are petty and jealous of your sister. I pulled my arm away, stepping back. Do not ever touch me again. I turned back to the teller, who was already typing rapidly on her keyboard. I want to freeze every single account associated with my social security number. I want all secondary access privileges revoked immediately. Nobody touches a single penny of my money without my physical presence and my signature. You cannot do that, my mother gasped. Her voice rose, drawing the attention of a security guard near the door. I need to transfer those funds today. Trevor already put down the non-refundable deposit on his credit card. The teller printed a receipt and handed it to me. The transfer is canceled, Miss Adams. The funds have been returned to the college savings account. I have also placed a hard freeze on all linked accounts, including the joint checking account. The joint checking account was the one I used to quietly pay for my father's highly expensive heart medication and my mother's premium dental insurance. It was the account they treated as their personal petty cash fund whenever they overspent their own limits. I funded their health care because they had managed their own finances so poorly they could not afford it, but they never acknowledged my contribution. My mother turned pale. She reached into her designer bag and pulled out her gold debit card, slapping it onto the counter. I need to withdraw $2,000 from checking right now, she demanded. I am sorry, Mom, the teller said, offering a polite but firm smile. That account is currently frozen by the primary account holder. Your card will decline. Brenda's face flushed a deep, humiliating red. Other customers in the bank lobby were openly staring at us now. She leaned in close to my face, her breath smelling of expensive coffee. You listen to me, you ungrateful child, she whispered, her voice shaking with absolute rage. You embarrassed your father this morning with that ridiculous legal notice on our door. And now you are doing this. Do not call the cops about this college fund money. Do not even think about it. If you make a scene, you will ruin your father's standing as a deacon. You know how the church talks. You do not want to be the reason your family loses its respectability. I looked at the woman who had raised me. She cared more about church gossip and a fraudulent tech startup than she cared about her own flesh and blood. She would gladly watch my son freeze in a broken apartment if it meant she could keep pretending to be wealthy to her friends. Respectability is a luxury you can no longer afford, Mom, I said. I picked up my license and walked away, leaving her standing at the teller window clutching a useless piece of plastic. The freezing wind hit my face as I walked back to my car, but I did not feel the chill. I got into my beat-up Honda Civic and locked the doors. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel. The worn-out interior of my car was a carefully calculated illusion. Everything about my visible life was a calculated illusion, meant to protect me from the exact people who had just tried to rob my son. I reached into the hidden compartment of my center console and pulled out a second cell phone. It was not the cheap prepaid phone my family thought I used, but a sleek encrypted device secured with biometric locks. I bypassed the security screens and dialed a number I usually only called from the safety of my downtown corporate office. The line rang twice before a sharp professional voice answered. Vivian speaking. Vivian, it is Desiree, I said, staring out at the snow-covered parking lot. It is time. Unseal the Apex medical portfolios. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of a keyboard clacking as my high-powered corporate attorney processed the command. Are you absolutely sure? Desiree Vivian asked. Her tone shifted from formal legal counsel to the trusted confidant who had helped me build my empire. Once we lift the blind trust protections, your corporate assets will be visible to targeted financial inquiries. You have spent 8 years keeping your family completely in the dark about your net worth. I am sure, I replied, my voice as hard as the concrete outside. They just tried to steal Jamal's college fund to finance Trevor's fake business. They think I am a desperate broke nurse who will just roll over and take their abuse. It is time they learned exactly who they are dealing with. I am pulling up the files now, Vivian said. The Apex Holdings portfolios are moving to active status. What is our first move? I want a full financial audit on Trevor's LLC. By the end of the day, I told her, I want to know every debt, every hidden loan, every unpaid tax bill associated with his name and my sister Bianca's name. Find out exactly how deep in the hole my father really is. They are drowning in debt to keep up this rich family facade, and I want to own the water they are drowning in. Consider it done, Vivian replied. I will have a comprehensive dossier on your desk by tomorrow morning. They will not know what hit them. I ended the call and tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. I started the engine and listened to the old Honda rattle and hum. For years I had let them look down on me. I had let Trevor make his endless microaggressions about my neighborhood and my job. I had let Bianca parade her designer clothes in front of me while calling me a charity case. I had done it to keep Jamal safe from their toxic financial greed. But they had come for his future anyway. Now I was going to systematically dismantle theirs. I drove back to my apartment and found Jamal awake, sitting on the couch wrapped in a thick blanket. The building heater was still broken, but I had purchased 2 powerful portable space heaters on my way home. I plugged them in and watched the glowing orange coils begin to push the freezing air out of the small room. Jamal looked up at me, his dark eyes observant and too old for his 13 years. Is Grandma mad? He asked quietly. She is not happy, I replied, sitting beside him and pulling him close. But you do not ever have to worry about her again. Your college money is safe. No one is going to take anything from you ever again. My regular cell phone began to vibrate violently on the coffee table. The screen lit up with my father's name, Calvin. I watched it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later it rang again, then again. My father was not a man who accepted being ignored. He was a deacon, a patriarch, a man who demanded absolute obedience from his wife and his daughters. Finally, a text message appeared on the screen. It was a long block of text composed with formal, terrifying authority. Desiree, your mother just came home in tears. Your actions at the bank today were an absolute disgrace to this family. You have disrespected your mother, humiliated your sister, and jeopardized your brother-in-law's legitimate business ventures. I will not tolerate this rebellion in my family. You are required to attend a mandatory family intervention tonight at 7 o'clock. We will be meeting in the private conference room at the church. The senior board members will be present to mediate this dispute and guide you back to the righteous path. Do not test my patience. Be there. I read the message twice. A cold smile touched the corners of my mouth. Calvin was retaliating the only way he knew how. He was using the church, his ultimate domain of power, to force me into submission. He was staging an ambush disguising a financial shakedown as a spiritual intervention. He intended to use the senior board members, the most respected and wealthy elders in our community, to shame me publicly. He thought the pressure of saving face in front of the congregation would break me. He thought I would fold under the weight of his religious authority and hand over my son's money just to avoid being cast out of the community. They always relied on my silence. They relied on the fact that I would endure any humiliation to keep the peace. But the woman who used to shrink under Calvin's disapproving glare died the moment Jamal had to pedal his bike through a blizzard because he did not match Bianca's Christmas aesthetic. I set the phone down and looked around my modest apartment. The peeling paint on the windowsills and the worn fabric of the sofa were stark reminders of the life I portrayed to the world. It was a life of struggle and exhaustion, a life that made me the perfect target for their condescension. But beneath that carefully constructed surface, I was the sole owner of a medical logistics empire that generated millions in annual revenue. I had built Apex Medical Staffing from a single desk in a rented co-working space into a powerhouse that supplied critical healthcare workers across the entire region. I had done it while working double shifts while raising a son alone, and while absorbing the constant barrage of insults from my own blood. They thought my stubborn refusal to take their bad financial advice was just foolish pride. They thought my exhaustion was the result of a dead-end job. They had no idea my exhaustion came from building a legacy that would ensure Jamal never had to beg for a seat at anyone's table. I stood up and walked to my bedroom closet. I pushed aside the row of faded blue scrubs and oversized sweaters. At the very back, hidden beneath a protective garment bag, was a tailored charcoal gray suit. I had bought it in Milan after closing my first major hospital contract. I had never worn it in front of my family. I pulled it out and ran my fingers over the fine wool fabric. Calvin wanted a meeting with the church board. He wanted to use the elders to intimidate me into handing over my hard-earned money to fund Trevor. He thought he was summoning a defeated broken nurse who would cry and apologize for overstepping her bounds. He was about to find out that he had summoned a predator. I began to get dressed, transforming myself from the family scapegoat into the chief executive officer I truly was. The intervention was set for 7. I was ready to bring the entire temple down around them. The drive to the church took 20 minutes, but it felt like traveling back in time. Mount Zion Fellowship was not just a place of worship. It was a fortress of social standing in our community. My father Calvin had spent 3 decades climbing its ranks to become the head deacon. To him, the church board was his personal court of law, and the senior elders were his jury. He had summoned me here tonight to put me on trial. I pulled my beat-up Honda into the sprawling parking lot. It was filled with Mercedes and Lexuses belonging to the church elite. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cold for a moment. My heart was completely calm. Underneath my heavy, worn winter coat, I was wearing the charcoal gray Milan suit. It felt like armor. I grabbed my leather portfolio from the passenger seat and walked toward the grand stone entrance. The sanctuary was dark, but warm light spilled from the frosted glass double doors of the senior executive conference room at the end of the main hallway. I pushed the doors open. The room was exactly as intimidating as it was designed to be. A massive polished oak table dominated the space, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. The walls were lined with portraits of past pastors and founders. Seated around the table were 6 of the most influential elders in the congregation. These were men and women who owned car dealerships, local real estate, and law firms. At the head of the table sat my father. He wore his finest 3-piece navy suit, his silver hair perfectly brushed. He looked every inch the powerful patriarch holding court. To his right sat my mother Brenda, dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the long-suffering matriarch to perfection. Next to her sat Bianca and Trevor. Bianca wore a modest but clearly expensive designer dress, her hands folded primly on the table. Trevor wore a tailored blazer, looking like a Silicon Valley visionary, gracing the local peasants with his presence. They all looked up when I walked in. "Desiree," my father said, his voice echoing in the large room. "Have a seat." I did not take off my winter coat. I pulled out the single empty chair at the opposite end of the table, leaving a vast expanse of polished oak between us. I placed my portfolio on the table and folded my hands. "Thank you for coming," Sister Adams, one of the elders, a wealthy man named Mr. Sterling, said in a deep, solemn voice. Your father brought a very troubling family matter to our attention. We are here tonight as mediators to help heal a wound before it destroys your family. My father stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket and looked around the room, making eye contact with every elder before his gaze finally settled on me. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Brothers and sisters, my father began, his voice thick with practiced sorrow. It breaks my heart to bring my own flesh and blood before you tonight. We raised our daughters in the church. We taught them the value of family, of loyalty, and of Christian charity. But the devil works in mysterious ways, and he often uses jealousy to poison the minds of those who have lost their way. He paused, letting this heavy silence fill the room. He looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment. Desiree has always struggled. We all know this. Being a single mother is a heavy burden. Working long hours at the hospital has clearly taken a toll on her mental health. She has become bitter. She looks at her sister Bianca, who is happily married to a brilliant man, and instead of rejoicing in their blessings, she harbors a dark resentment. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of polite interest. I let him dig the hole deeper. Yesterday, my father continued, his voice rising with theatrical indignation. That resentment boiled over into sheer malice. Desiree drove to her mother's bank and used a technical loophole to freeze her own mother's accounts. She cut off the very funds that pay for my life-saving heart medication. She drained the accounts we used to support her own son. And she did all of this simply to sabotage Trevor's technology business out of pure, unadulterated spite. A collective gasp rippled through the elders. Mrs. Washington, a prominent choir director and one of my mother's closest friends, shook her head in disgust. She leaned over to Bianca. Bianca gave a tragic little sigh and whispered back, but she made sure her voice was just loud enough to carry across the quiet room. It is just so sad, Mrs. Washington. She has always been like this. Ever since we were kids, she resented me. She has been bitter ever since I got the private school tuition and she had to go to community college. We tried to include her, but she just cannot handle being around successful people. It reminds her of her own failures. Mrs. Washington patted Bianca's hand sympathetically and glared at me. Trevor decided it was his turn to play the victim. He adjusted his glasses and offered a tight, strained smile to the board. I do not want to cause any trouble, he said, using his best humble entrepreneur voice. I just want to provide for my family. My startup is on the verge of a massive breakthrough. We are talking about technology that will change the medical field. I just needed a temporary bridge loan from Calvin and Brenda to secure a final meeting with a major investor. Desiree's actions yesterday almost derailed months of hard work. I forgive her, of course. She does not understand how business works. She is just a nurse. My father nodded approvingly at Trevor. You see the grace this man shows, he told the room. We are asking you tonight, Desiree, to repent. We are asking you to unfreeze the accounts and sign the release forms transferring the $45,000 back to Trevor. If you do this, we will pray over you. We will forgive your sins and welcome you back into the fold of this family. He gestured to the elders. Brother Sterling will lead us in a prayer of forgiveness for Desiree. Please bow your heads. Every person in the room bowed their head and closed their eyes. The silence was absolute. I did not bow my head. I stood up. The scraping of my wooden chair against the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. Eyes snapped open. My father frowned deeply, his authoritative facade cracking for a split second. I told you to bow your head, Desiree, he snapped. I ignored him. I slowly unbuttoned my heavy winter coat and slipped it off my shoulders. I draped it over the back of my chair. The charcoal gray Milan suit underneath was immaculate. It was cut from a fabric that whispered of wealth and commanded absolute authority. The elders, who were all business owners themselves, immediately recognized the shift. The tired, overworked single mother in cheap scrubs had vanished. The woman standing at the end of the table was a corporate predator, and they could feel the change in the air. We will not be praying tonight, I said. My voice was calm even, and projected effortlessly across the long table. There will be no repentance. There will be no unfreezing of any accounts, and there certainly will not be any money transferred to Trevor. My mother gasped. Desiree Adams, how dare you speak to the elders this way? I picked up my leather portfolio and opened it. I pulled out a stack of financial documents my lawyer Vivian had compiled for me that morning. I did not look at my mother. I kept my eyes locked on Trevor. You talk a lot about your brilliant technology startup, Trevor, I said, taking slow, deliberate steps down the side of the long mahogany table. You tell my parents you are on the verge of changing the medical field. You tell this respected board of elders that I am just a bitter nurse trying to sabotage your success. So let us talk about your success. Trevor shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. A thin sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. This is a private family matter, Desiree. We do not need to bore the board with technical business jargon. Oh, I think the board would be very interested in the business they are being asked to endorse, I replied. I stopped walking and tossed a crisp white document directly in front of Mr. Sterling. I tossed another copy in front of Mrs. Washington. What exactly does your tech company do, Trevor? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously pleasant. Because according to the State Business Registry, your company is a Shell LLC. According to the federal database, you hold absolutely no patents. You have no proprietary software. You have 0 employees. In fact, public tax records show that your brilliant tech company has not filed a single tax return in 3 years because you have 0 revenue. The room fell dead silent. Mr. Sterling picked up the document and adjusted his reading glasses. He was a seasoned businessman. It took him exactly 10 seconds to realize what he was looking at. He looked up at Trevor, his eyes narrowing. Trevor swallowed hard. His face flushed a dark, angry red. You do not know what you are talking about, he stammered. Tech startups operate in stealth mode all the time. We are in the pre-revenue development phase. You are looking at outdated public filings. Pre-revenue development phase 1 repeated, letting a small, cold smile touch my lips. That is a very fancy way of saying you have been unemployed for 3 years while living entirely off the credit cards my father pays for. It is a fancy way of saying you tried to steal $45,000 from a 13-year-old boy's college fund to rent a luxury yacht to keep up your pathetic charade. Calvin slammed his hand on the table. That is enough, he roared. I will not sit here and let you slander this man. Trevor is securing an investment that will make this family millions. I turned to my father. You are a fool, Calvin. You mortgaged your own home to fund a man who uses buzzwords to hide the fact that he is a complete failure. And you let him convince you to kick your own grandson out into a blizzard. You are no patriarch. You are just a mark. My father turned purple with rage. He stood up, pointing a trembling finger at me. You are out of your mind. Trevor has meetings with top-tier venture capitalists. He has a major angel investor ready to hand him a $2 million bridge loan this very week. I raised an eyebrow, turning back to Trevor. Is that right, Trevor? A $2 million bridge loan? That is fascinating. Please tell the board who is this magical angel investor willing to give $2 million to a company with no product and no revenue. Trevor sat up straighter, sensing an opportunity to regain the upper hand. He puffed out his chest and looked around the room, addressing the elders rather than me. He smirked, dripping with unearned arrogance. Not that it is any of your business, Desiree, but since you insist on embarrassing yourself, I will tell you. My investor is not some local bank. They are a multi-million-dollar private medical logistics conglomerate. They control regional healthcare contracts across the entire state. They have reviewed my pitch deck, and they are incredibly interested in my vision. Trevor paused for dramatic effect, soaking in the impressed murmurs from my parents and a few of the elders. He looked at me with absolute contempt. The firm is called Apex Medical, he announced proudly. Their chief executive officer is personally reviewing my file as we speak. So yes, I am securing a $2 million deal from Apex. And once that check clears, I will gladly refund your little college account with interest. You just do not understand how high-level corporate finance works. I stared at him. I stared at his smug, arrogant face. I stared at my father, who was nodding proudly at his son-in-law. I stared at my sister, who was smiling triumphantly at me as if she had just won a war. For a moment, the sheer, unbelievable irony of the universe left me completely speechless. Trevor, the man who had mocked my job and insulted my son, was standing in a church boardroom, trying to use my own secret company to intimidate me. He was bragging about pitching a fraudulent business to Apex Medical. I looked down at the mahogany table. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, just to keep myself from bursting into hysterical laughter. The urge to laugh was so powerful it physically hurt my chest. I took a slow, deep breath, composing my features into a mask of polite curiosity. I looked back up at Trevor, meeting his arrogant gaze. "Apex Medical," I said, my voice soft and careful. "You are securing a $2 million investment from Apex Medical." "That is right," Trevor said, crossing his arms over his chest. "So you can take your little public records and your frozen bank accounts and leave. We are done here." I slowly nodded. I reached out and picked up my winter coat, slipping it back over my shoulders. I gathered my leather portfolio. "Well, Trevor," I said, turning toward the conference room doors, "I wish you the best of luck with your meeting at Apex. I hear their chief executive officer is extremely thorough when reviewing fraudulent pitch decks." I did not wait for a response. I walked out of the conference room, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind me. As I walked down the quiet church hallway, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Vivian, my lawyer. The text read simply, "I have the full audit on Trevor and your father. It is worse than we thought. Are we proceeding with the Apex term sheet?" I pushed open the church exit doors and stepped out into the freezing winter night. I typed my reply as I walked to my car. "String him along. Offer Trevor the $2 million conditional term sheet, but demand my father's house and Bianca's assets as collateral. We are taking everything." The drive from the church to the downtown financial district took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like crossing into another universe. I navigated my beat-up Honda Civic through the quiet residential streets, leaving behind the grand brick buildings of my father's religious kingdom. As the city skyline rose before me, glittering with cold corporate light, I felt the tension bleed out of my shoulders. My family thought they knew me. They thought my life was defined by the faded upholstery of my car and the worn-out soles of my nursing shoes. They had no idea that the skyline towering above me was where I actually belonged. As I pulled into the secure underground parking garage of the Apex Medical Building, my mind drifted back to the suffocating exhaustion of 8 years ago. Back then, I was exactly what my father accused me of being today. I was a struggling single mother, working 80-hour weeks as a travel nurse just to keep food on the table. My parents had refused to help me with childcare or rent. Calvin told me my struggle was a necessary lesson in consequences. Brenda told me I should have married better. I spent my nights sitting at a scratched kitchen table in a cramped apartment, waiting for Jamal to fall asleep so I could cry without him hearing. But that exhaustion birthed a desperation that completely rewired my brain. While working on the hospital floors, I noticed the chaotic, inefficient nightmare of medical staffing. Ward managers were spending hours on the phone begging for coverage, while nurses were burning out from terrible scheduling. The agencies acting as middlemen were bloated, slow, and greedy. I saw the gap clearly. I took the very last of my modest savings and hired a brilliant, hungry software developer I met at a late-night diner. Together, we built an algorithm that matched critical care nurses to hospital shifts with ruthless efficiency. I pitched that software to a struggling regional hospital and promised them a 30% reduction in overhead costs. They took a chance on me. Within 6 months, I had 5 more hospitals on contract. Within 3 years, Apex Medical Staffing was a regional powerhouse. Today, my company controls 40% of the nursing logistics across the entire state. My personal net worth sits comfortably past $30 million. Yet I kept the Honda Civic. I kept the modest apartment with the broken heater. I continued to pick up occasional weekend shifts in the emergency room. I did it because I saw what the illusion of wealth had done to Calvin and Brenda. Their desperate pursuit of status had turned them into hollow, cruel people who valued country club memberships more than their own grandchildren. I wanted Jamal to grow up understanding the value of hard work. I wanted him to know how to survive in the real world before he ever learned what it meant to have a trust fund. My poverty was a shield against my family's insatiable greed. I parked the Honda between a sleek black Porsche and a silver Bentley. I took the private executive elevator directly to the top floor. When the polished steel doors slid open, I stepped into a reception area of flawless white marble and floor-to-ceiling glass. The night view of the city was breathtaking. Vivian was waiting for me in my corner office. My brilliant lead corporate counsel was sitting at the massive glass conference table with a thick stack of manila folders spread out before her. She wore a tailored crimson suit and a predatory smile. "You look like you just survived a holy war," Vivian said, pouring 2 glasses of sparkling water and sliding one across the table to me. "I survived a shakedown," I replied, taking a seat and unbuttoning my jacket. Calvin tried to use the church elders to shame me into handing over Jamal's college fund. Trevor stood up and bragged about an impending $2 million investment from a major medical conglomerate. He actually named Apex. Vivian let out a sharp laugh. The sheer audacity of that man is almost impressive. Almost. "I have been digging through the audit on his LLC since you called. It is completely embarrassing, Desiree. I do not even know how he manages to secure meetings with real investors." She slid a glossy presentation binder toward me. It was Trevor's pitch deck. I opened it and began flipping through the heavy, expensive pages. It was filled with generic stock photos of doctors looking thoughtfully at glowing blue screens and paragraphs of meaningless tech jargon. "Trevor is claiming he developed a proprietary algorithm for predictive patient care," Vivian said, tapping a manicured finger on the table. "But the intellectual property is completely stolen." I ran the code snippets he included in his technical overview. He literally copied and pasted the framework from an open-source project that failed in California 5 years ago. He does not hold a single patent. He has absolutely no proprietary software. I turned to the financial projections page. Trevor had fabricated a revenue model that promised $40 million in profit within 2 years. He claimed to have letters of intent from 3 major hospital networks. "Are these letters real?" I asked, pointing to the executive summary. "Complete forgeries," Vivian replied seamlessly. I personally called the acquisitions directors at all 3 networks. None of them have ever heard of Trevor Adams. His LLC has 0 assets. He has not filed a federal tax return in 3 years because he has 0 income. But he does have debt, a massive amount of it. Vivian handed me another folder. "This is the financial profile on your father and your sister. Calvin is drowning, Desiree. He took out a massive second mortgage on the family estate to finance Bianca's lifestyle and to provide Trevor with seed money. They have maxed out 6 different high-yield credit lines. Calvin is 2 months behind on his property taxes. If they do not secure a major infusion of cash within the next 90 days, the bank is going to foreclose on everything. Trevor is their last desperate gamble." I stared at the financial ruin laid out on the table. They were living in a house of cards ready to collapse in the slightest breeze. They were so desperate to maintain the illusion of high society success that they were willing to rob a 13-year-old boy. "So how do we play this?" Vivian asked, leaning forward. "Do we send a formal rejection from Apex and watch them default on their loans?" I closed the pitch deck and looked out the massive glass window at the city below. The memory of Jamal's face eating dry generic cereal in a freezing apartment burned hot in my chest. A simple rejection was too clean. It was too easy. They needed to feel the exact kind of devastating loss they had tried to inflict on my son. "We are not rejecting him," I said, my voice dropping to a cold whisper. "I want you to string him along, Vivian. Draft a formal term sheet from Apex Medical Holdings. Offer Trevor exactly what he wants. A $2 million bridge loan to finalize his imaginary software." Vivian raised an eyebrow, her legal mind racing ahead. "A $2 million offer will require absolute guarantees. A shell company with 0 revenue cannot secure that kind of capital without personal backing." "Exactly," I said, turning back to her. "Make the term sheet strictly conditional. Apex will provide the $2 million, but we require absolute personal collateral to secure the risk. Demand Calvin's estate. Demand the deed to the house. Demand Bianca's trust funds. Demand Trevor's vehicles. Ask for every single tangible asset they possess to back the loan. They will never sign away the family estate, Vivian said, looking skeptical. Calvin is too proud. He would never risk the house. You are underestimating their greed, I replied. Calvin believes Trevor is a genius. Trevor believes his own lies. They think Apex is run by a faceless board of wealthy investors who are foolish enough to buy into their aesthetic. When they see a $2 million offer on official corporate letterhead, they will be blinded by the money. They will gladly sign their lives away because they think they have finally hit the jackpot. Vivian smiled a slow, dangerous smile. I will make the contract ironclad. The default clauses will be brutal. If Trevor fails to produce a working prototype within 60 days of the disbursement, Apex will have the legal right to seize all collateral immediately without a grace period. Do it, I said. Have the acquisitions team email Trevor the term sheet tomorrow morning. Keep my name completely scrubbed from all correspondence. Let them think they have won. I left the office well past midnight, feeling a profound sense of closure. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for them to walk willingly into the jaws of their own financial destruction. The next morning, I woke up and put on my faded blue scrubs. I drove my old Honda to the hospital for my scheduled 12-hour emergency room shift. I loved my clinical work. It kept me grounded. It reminded me why I had built Apex in the first place. The chaos of the ER, the flashing monitors, the desperate need to provide real care to real people was the antithesis of my family's shallow existence. The first few hours of my shift were a blur of minor traumas and seasonal flu cases. I was charting vitals at the nurse's station when the charge nurse Sarah walked up to me. Her face was pale and she looked deeply uncomfortable. Desiree, Sarah said, her voice hushed. You need to come to the administrative office right now. The floor director is waiting for you. I frowned, setting down my chart. Is there a problem with a patient? Sarah shook her head, refusing to meet my eyes. Just go. It is serious. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I walked down the long white corridor toward the administrative wing. When I stepped into the director's office, I found my supervisor sitting behind her desk, looking incredibly grim. Sitting opposite her was a man in a dark suit holding a thick clipboard. Desiree. Please close the door, my supervisor said. This is Mr. Evans. He is an investigator with the State Nursing Board. I closed the door, my heart rate accelerating. What is going on? Mr. Evans stood up and looked at me with clinical detachment. Miss Adams, early this morning, the State Board received a detailed anonymous complaint regarding your clinical license. The complaint alleges severe medical malpractice. It accuses you of deliberately mishandling restricted narcotic medications and engaging in willful patient neglect over the past 3 months. I stared at him in total shock. That is a complete lie. I have a flawless clinical record. I have never mishandled a single medication in my life. Who filed this complaint? The complaint is anonymous, Mr. Evans replied smoothly. However, the allegations include highly specific internal details regarding your shift schedules and access codes. Due to the severity of the accusations involving narcotics, the board has no choice but to initiate an immediate and full investigation. Effective right now, your clinical nursing license is suspended pending a formal hearing. You are to be escorted from the premises. The room spun. The sterile hospital walls felt like they were closing in. I stood there as the sheer vindictive cruelty of the situation crashed over me. Bianca. It had to be Bianca. She had been humiliated at the church when I walked out. She knew my nursing career was the one thing I took absolute pride in. She thought I was just a poor, struggling nurse, and she wanted to destroy my only source of income to teach me a lesson. She had filed a fake malpractice claim to rip away my livelihood. I looked at the investigator and then at my supervisor. The cold clarity that had guided me the night before returned, pushing the panic aside. Bianca thought she had just ruined my life. She had no idea she had just poured gasoline on a fire. I will clear out my locker, I said, my voice dangerously calm. But this investigation is going to uncover a lot more than you are prepared for. I turned and walked out of the office. The war had officially escalated, and I was taking no prisoners. I walked down the sterile white hallway with the security guard a half step behind me. My colleagues, the same nurses and doctors I had worked alongside for years, suddenly found reasons to look at their clipboards or stare intently at their computer screens as I passed. The silence in the emergency department was deafening. The walk from the administrative wing to the staff locker room felt like miles, but I kept my head held high. I did not rush, and I did not look down. I opened my locker and quietly packed my stethoscope, my extra scrubs, and the small framed photograph of Jamal into my tote bag. Mr. Evans, the state board investigator, watched me with cold bureaucratic detachment. He escorted me all the way to the sliding glass doors and watched as I stepped out into the freezing winter air. The heavy automatic doors clicked shut behind me, severing my connection to the hospital. I walked across the slush-covered parking lot to my beat-up Honda Civic. I unlocked the door, tossed my bag onto the passenger seat, and slid behind the wheel. The cold inside the car was absolute, but it paled in comparison to the ice in my veins. I did not start the engine right away. I gripped the steering wheel and let my mind process the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. A severe anonymous malpractice complaint. Accusations of mishandling restricted narcotics. Willful patient neglect. These were not minor infractions. These were career-ending federal-level allegations that could result in prison time. Mr. Evans had said the complaint contained highly specific internal details regarding my shift schedules and dispensary access codes. I closed my eyes and pieced it together. The puzzle was not complicated, it was just incredibly malicious. Bianca knew my schedule. She had always complained about my weird nursing hours whenever she wanted me to run errands for her. She had visited me at the hospital a few times in the past, demanding I give her cash from the ATM in the lobby. She could have easily peeked over my shoulder to see my employee ID number or watched me punch in my access code at the nurse's station. But Bianca did not have the technical knowledge to file an untraceable complaint and forge dispensary logs. Trevor did. Trevor's tech company was a complete sham, but he spent all his time pretending to be a Silicon Valley hacker. He knew enough basic coding and network manipulation to spoof an IP address. He knew how to fabricate a digital paper trail. Together they had orchestrated a targeted character assassination. They had deliberately framed me for stealing narcotics. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They were not just trying to embarrass me. They were trying to destroy my only visible livelihood. They wanted to strip away my income so I would be completely desperate. They knew I had a teenage son to feed and a roof to keep over our heads. They calculated that a suspended broke and terrified single mother would have no choice but to crawl back to the family patriarch and beg for mercy. They were willing to risk sending me to federal prison just to force me into submission so they could steal $45,000. My regular cell phone began to vibrate in the cup holder. I looked down at the screen. It was my mother, Brenda. I let it ring 3 times before I reached down and swiped to answer. I brought the phone to my ear, but I did not say a word. I wanted to hear exactly how she would play this. "Desiree, honey?" My mother's voice floated through the speaker. It was dripping with a thick, syrupy layer of fake maternal sympathy. "We just heard the terrible news about your job. Your father got a call from one of the church members who works in hospital administration. We are just so devastated for you." I stared out the windshield at the gray winter sky. They had not heard the news from a church member. They had filed the complaint themselves and were eagerly waiting for the fallout. I remained completely silent. "I know you must be terrified." Brenda continued, her tone taking on a pious, preachy rhythm. "But Desiree, you have to look at the bigger picture here. See, this is God punishing you. You turned your back on your family. You embarrassed your father in front of the entire church board last night. You acted out of bitter jealousy toward your sister and her successful husband. When you walk away from the righteous path, the Lord has a way of humbling you. He takes away the things you take pride in, so you will learn to lean on your family again." My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. The absolute evil required to frame your own daughter for a felony and then claim it was divine retribution was beyond comprehension. "But your father is a forgiving man." Desiree, my mother said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He wants to help you. He knows you are facing serious criminal charges. He knows you cannot afford a legal defense on a suspended nurse's salary. He is willing to throw you a lifeline. If you just come over to the house tonight, apologize for your behavior, and sign over the rest of Jamal's college fund to Trevor's business account, your father will pay for a cheap lawyer to help you with the nursing board. He will make sure you do not go to jail. We can put all this ugliness behind us. The proposition was so incredibly vile it almost sounded rehearsed. Extortion disguised as charity. They had lit my house on fire and were now offering to sell me a bucket of water for the price of my son's entire future. I did not yell. I did not curse. I did not tell her that she was a monster. Screaming would only give her the satisfaction of knowing she had struck a nerve. It would make her think her plan was working. I am going to hang up now, Mom, I said, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Desiree, do not be foolish. Brenda snapped, her fake sympathy instantly evaporating. You have no money and you are facing federal charges. You need us. You have no other choice. I pulled the phone away from my ear and tapped the red end call button. I tossed the device onto the passenger seat. For 34 years, I had tried to find some redeeming quality in my family. I had searched for scraps of genuine love beneath the constant criticism. I had convinced myself that their cruelty was just a product of generational trauma or misguided protectiveness. But this was not misguided. This was predatory. They were a pack of wolves and they had just bared their teeth at my child. I reached into the hidden compartment of my center console and pulled out the encrypted secure phone. The device felt heavy and cool in my hand. I stared at the blank screen for a long moment. Until today, I had only used this phone to build an empire, to manage contracts, to negotiate legitimate business deals. I had never used my wealth as a weapon. I had always believed that success was the best revenge, and that simply living well out of their sight was enough. But living well was no longer an option. They had breached the walls. They had come for my license. They had come for my freedom. They had tried to take the food out of Jamal's mouth. I unlocked the phone and dialed Vivian's direct line. She answered on the first ring. Desiree, Vivian said, her voice brisk and alert. I was just reviewing the Apex term sheet for Trevor. The legal trap is perfectly set. We are ready to send it over. Hold the term sheet, I said. There was a pause on the line. Are we adjusting the collateral requirements? Vivian asked. I watched a group of nurses walk across the parking lot laughing and holding their coffees. I had spent 8 years building a medical logistics empire that placed thousands of nurses just like them in hospitals across the state. I held more power in the healthcare industry than anyone in my family could possibly imagine. The state nursing board did not know who I was because my corporate assets were buried under blind trusts, but the people who pulled the strings at the state level certainly knew the name Apex Medical. Vivian, I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register. My nursing license was just suspended. An anonymous complaint was filed with the state board accusing me of stealing narcotics and patient neglect. Trevor and Bianca fabricated it to extort me for the $45,000. The silence on the line was absolute. When Vivian finally spoke, her voice was like cracked ice. Give me 10 minutes. I will have the state board commissioner on the phone. I will have their entire investigation squashed before lunch. I will file a defamation suit against Trevor that will bury him so deep he will never see daylight again. No, I said, cutting her off. Forget the nursing board for now. Let them investigate. Let Trevor and Bianca think they have won. Let Calvin think I am broke and desperate. Desiree. They are trying to put you in prison, Vivian argued. We need to unleash the legal department right now. I do not want to defend myself. Vivian, I said, staring at the hospital building. Defending myself means playing their game. I want to end the game entirely. I want to own the board they are playing on. What do you want me to do? Vivian asked, her tone shifting into pure corporate warfare mode. I want to buy their debt, I said. I want you to create 3 new anonymous holding companies. I want you to contact the banks that hold Calvin's primary mortgage and his second mortgage. I want you to buy them out. I want you to track down the predatory lenders who hold Trevor's credit card debt and auto loans. Buy those too. Buy Bianca's credit lines. Buy every single financial obligation attached to the Addams family name. I do not care what it costs. Pay a premium if you have to. Desiree, buying consumer and mortgage debt at a premium is a massive capital expenditure, Vivian warned. I have $30 million in liquid assets sitting in the Apex Expansion Fund, I replied. Use it. I want to hold the paper on their entire existence. I want to own the roof over their heads. I want to own the cars they drive. I want to own the beds they sleep in. Vivian let out a low whistle. A hostile financial takeover of your own family. If we buy the debt, we control the collection terms. Since Calvin and Trevor are already in default, we can accelerate the collection process. We can initiate immediate foreclosure on the estate. Exactly, I said. They tried to take my livelihood, so I am going to take everything they have ever cared about. They worship money and status. I am going to strip them of both. Buy the debt, Vivian. All of it. Consider it done, she said. It will take a few days to negotiate the transfers with the banks, but by the end of the week you will legally own your family. What about the Apex term sheet for Trevor? Send it, I commanded. Let Trevor sign the contract offering the house and cars as collateral for the fake $2 million loan. Let him double leverage assets he is about to lose. When the trap finally snaps shut, I want them to realize there is no way out. I ended the call and tossed the secure phone onto the passenger seat. I started the engine of the Honda Civic. The heater blasted cold air into my face, but I did not shiver. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the hospital parking lot. I drove back toward my broken apartment, knowing that within a matter of days I would be the most powerful landlord in their exclusive gated community. The days of me being the victim were over. I was coming for the throne. I spent the next 4 days completely away from the hospital. The suspension should have felt like a death sentence, but instead, it felt like a much-needed breath of fresh air. I stayed in my small apartment and cooked real dinners for Jamal. I helped him with his algebra homework, and we watched movies on our old television. I slept for 8 straight hours a night for the first time in months. I let my family believe I was hiding in shame. I let them think I was paralyzed by the fear of losing my nursing license and going to federal prison. They needed to believe they had completely destroyed me so they would drop their guard. They needed to feel invincible. Meanwhile, Vivian was executing the most aggressive financial acquisition of her entire career. She called me on Thursday morning and told me to come to her downtown office immediately. I put on a simple gray sweater and drove my beat-up Honda Civic back into the glittering financial district. When I arrived at the Apex corporate building, the glass conference table in Vivian's office was covered in thick stacks of legal documents. Vivian was pacing the room in a sharp black suit. She looked like a predator who had just cornered her prey. She poured me a glass of sparkling water and pushed the largest stack of paper across the polished glass table. "It is done, Desiree," she said, her eyes shining with absolute ruthless triumph. "You own every single debt attached to the Addams family bloodline." I sat down and began reading through the contracts. The sheer level of financial incompetence laid out in front of me was absolutely staggering. Trevor and Bianca were not just living beyond their means. They were living in a complete fantasy world constructed entirely out of high-interest loans and predatory credit lines. Vivian explained the intricate details as I flipped through the heavy pages. Calvin had quietly signed the deed of the family estate over to Bianca 2 years ago. He did it to protect the house from his own mounting debts and questionable tax filings, but he had essentially handed the keys to his kingdom over to a pair of reckless fools. Trevor had immediately used his new asset to secure capital. He had taken out 3 separate mortgages on my childhood home. He used the cash to fund his fake technology startup, to lease a fleet of luxury vehicles, and to buy expensive designer jewelry for Bianca. He was literally paying the interest on the first mortgage by drawing cash from the second. It was a classic house of cards built on arrogance and delusion. They were leveraged so deep they could barely breathe, and they had zero incoming revenue to cover the massive monthly payments. Every dime they spent was borrowed money. And now I held the paper on all of it. Apex Holdings had purchased the mortgages from the regional bank at a premium. We bought the auto loans on Trevor's luxury cars. We bought the outstanding credit card debt that Bianca used to fund her shopping sprees. I was legally their sole creditor. If they missed a single payment, I had the power to foreclose on the estate and repossess the vehicles without warning. I sat there tracing my finger over the signatures on the documents. I owned the house where I grew up. I owned the formal dining room, where my father used to tell me I would never amount to anything. I owned the sprawling driveway where they had mocked my old Honda Civic. I owned them completely. What amazed me most was their reaction to the financial shift. You would think that having all your debt consolidated by a massive corporate entity would trigger some severe alarm bells. Any rational person would be terrified to see their entire financial existence swallowed up by a single holding company. But arrogance makes people blind. Vivian had her financial analysts monitor Trevor's business accounts and public filings to gauge their response. Instead of panicking, Trevor and Calvin were celebrating. They received the formal legal notices that their debts had been purchased and transferred to an Apex subsidiary. But their inflated egos spun the narrative into something entirely different. They genuinely believed that Apex was clearing their books as a gesture of good faith. They thought the mysterious angel investor at Apex was tidying up their financial portfolio to prepare for the massive $2 million cash drop. They thought they had been chosen for greatness. They thought their fraudulent pitch deck had actually worked. Vivian pulled out her tablet and showed me a social media post Bianca had made that very morning. It was a picture of Trevor and Calvin smoking expensive cigars on the back patio of the family estate. The caption read, "Celebrating massive corporate acquisitions with my brilliant husband and father. The future is brighter than ever. God is so good." I stared at the picture on the glowing screen. I looked at the smug satisfaction radiating from my father's face. He actually believed he had won. He believed he had successfully crushed my nursing career, stolen my son's college fund, and secured a multi-million-dollar future for his golden child. He had no idea he was smoking a cigar on a patio that I now legally owned. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet belonged to the daughter he had just tried to send to prison. The irony was so rich and potent it was almost intoxicating. Their delusion only grew stronger as the end of December approached. Trevor was so confident that the $2 million investment was imminent that he decided to throw a massive party to celebrate his impending wealth. He and Bianca began planning an extravagant New Year Eve gala at the family mansion. The purpose of the party was twofold. First, they wanted to show off their imaginary success to the entire church congregation and the local business elite. Second, they intended to use the gala to formally welcome the chief executive officer of Apex Medical. They had sent a lavish gold-embossed invitation to the corporate headquarters, practically begging the CEO to attend as their guest of honor. They wanted to wine and dine the phantom billionaire who was about to make them rich. They were hiring private caterers, bringing in expensive floral arrangements, and renting luxury heated tents for the estate grounds. They booked a live jazz band and a private valet service for the driveway. They were spending thousands of dollars they did not even have, relying completely on the promise of the upcoming loan to cover the extravagant costs. They were building a monument to their own vanity right on top of a landmine, and they were inviting everyone they knew to come watch it explode. A few days later, I was sitting in my living room reading a book while Jamal played a video game on the floor. My phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text message from Bianca. She had not spoken to me since the state nursing board suspended my license. She had not called to check on Jamal or to see how we were surviving without my income. I picked up the phone and opened the message. It contained a digital invitation to the New Year Eve gala. The design was obnoxiously opulent with gold lettering and a sweeping drone photograph of the family estate in the background. But it was the text beneath the invitation that showed the true depth of her cruelty. The message read, "I know things are really tough for you right now. Desiree, especially with you losing your job and facing those awful criminal charges. But Trevor and I are celebrating a massive multi-million-dollar business deal with Apex on New Year Eve. We are hosting the top executives at the house, and it is going to be the event of the year. Since you are unemployed and probably struggling to buy groceries, we thought you might want to come and work the event. We are paying the catering staff $20 an hour to serve drinks and clear plates. It would be a good way for you to make some quick cash, and you could see what real success looks like. Let me know if you want the catering manager's phone number. Do not worry, I will not tell the guests about your legal troubles. I read the message twice just to make sure I was not hallucinating. I let the sheer unfiltered malice of her words wash over me. She wanted me to wear a catering uniform and serve champagne to her friends in the house that I owned. She wanted to parade her imaginary victory in my face while I supposedly suffered in poverty and disgrace. She wanted me to hand out appetizers to the church elders who had judged me. She thought she had completely broken my spirit. She thought she was the undisputed queen of the family, and that I was nothing more than a pathetic failure begging for scraps at her table. I looked over at Jamal. He was laughing at something on the television screen, completely unaware of the vicious war being waged around him. I promised myself long ago that I would protect him from their toxicity. I had tried to do it by staying quiet and keeping my distance, but silence had only made them bolder. It was time to show them exactly what happened when you pushed a quiet person too far. I did not reply to Bianca's message. I did not need to give her the satisfaction of a response. I simply took a screenshot of the invitation and forwarded it to Vivian with a single line of text. Tell the catering company we are adding one more guest to the VIP list. The Chief Executive Officer of Apex Medical will be attending the gala in person. Vivian replied less than a minute later. Her message was simple and sharp. I will have your driver ready at 8 o'clock. Wear something expensive. I locked my phone and set it back on the table. A deep, profound calm settled over me. The trap was fully armed and the bait had been taken. My family was about to host the most expensive party of their lives to celebrate a victory that did not exist. They were going to fill my house with hundreds of witnesses. They had built the perfect stage for their own destruction. All I had to do now was walk through the front door and let them hand me the crown. The morning of New Year's Eve arrived with a bitter frost that coated the windows of my apartment. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, drinking black coffee, when my phone lit up with another message from Bianca. She apparently felt her previous digital invitation was not quite humiliating enough and wanted to clarify my exact role for the evening. The message read, I spoke with the catering manager, and we decided you would be best suited for the coat check room. Since you lost your nursing job and are probably broke, we are offering you a chance to earn $100 for the night. The Chief Executive Officer of Apex is coming, and we need everything to be absolutely flawless. Make sure you dress like the help. Wear plain black clothes and stay out of sight in the front hallway. Do not try to mingle with the guests and leave Jamal at home. This is an exclusive adult event, not a charity daycare. I read the words slowly, letting the profound arrogance wash over me. She wanted to pay me $100 to hide in a closet and hold her guests' winter coats. She wanted to banish my son from his own family home because he did not fit her aesthetic of imaginary wealth. She was so intoxicated by the illusion of her impending $2 million fortune that she had lost whatever tiny shred of humanity she had left. I set my coffee mug down. I typed my reply using exactly 4 words. I will be there. I put the phone away and walked into Jamal's bedroom. He was sitting on the floor building a complex structure out of plastic bricks. He looked up at me with those bright, intelligent eyes that always saw right through my brave faces. He knew things had been tense lately. He knew I was not going to the hospital for my regular shifts. But he never complained. He just adjusted to the quiet rhythm of our apartment with a maturity that broke my heart. I sat down on the floor next to him and picked up a blue brick. We are going to have a very different kind of New Year Eve tonight, Jamal, I said, keeping my voice gentle but firm. Are we going to watch the ball drop on television? He asked, snapping a piece into place. I shook my head. No, We are going to get dressed up and go for a ride. I have some business to take care of tonight, and when the clock strikes midnight, everything is going to change for us. We are not going to worry about the heating bill anymore. We are not going to worry about your college tuition. We are going to take back exactly what belongs to us." He studied my face for a long moment. "Are we going to see Grandma and Grandpa?" he asked. "We are," I replied. "And Aunt Bianca and Uncle Trevor, too. But it is not going to be like the other times. Tonight they are going to learn a very important lesson about how the world actually works." Jamal just nodded. He trusted me completely. I hugged him tight, breathing in the scent of his shampoo, making a silent vow that no one in the Addams family would ever make him feel small again. If I was going to walk into a house of predators, I needed armor. I left Jamal with my trusted neighbor and drove to the most exclusive luxury boutique in the downtown shopping district. For years, I had walked past these glass storefronts in my cheap scrubs, looking at dresses that cost more than my car. Today, I walked straight through the heavy brass doors. A perfectly groomed saleswoman approached me with a polite but dismissive smile, clearly taking in my faded jeans and worn-out winter coat. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her tone suggesting I was in the wrong store. "I need a gown," I said. "Haute couture, floor length, something that commands absolute authority in a room full of arrogant men." The saleswoman blinked, her smile faltering slightly. "Our evening wear begins at $5,000, madam," she said. I pulled a sleek black titanium card from my wallet and placed it on the glass display counter. The card was tied directly to the Apex executive accounts. "Show me the best piece in the building," I said. Her entire demeanor shifted instantly. She ushered me into a private fitting room and brought me a glass of expensive champagne. For the next hour, I tried on silks and velvets until she brought out an absolute masterpiece. It was a custom deep emerald green gown spun from liquid silk that clung to my frame like a second skin before flowing into a dramatic sweeping train. The neckline was sharp and architectural, and the back plunged dangerously low. It did not look like a dress you wore to a party. It looked like a dress you wore to a coronation. It cost $10,000. I swiped the titanium card without blinking. I bought matching emerald heels that felt like daggers and a heavy diamond choker that rested against my collarbone like a blade. Bianca wanted me to dress like the help. I was going to show her what the owner of the house actually looked like. With my armor secured, I needed my army. I called Vivian from the boutique dressing room. The legal documents transferring the deeds and the debt were fully finalized and notarized. The trap was locked. "I need security, Vivian," I said, walking out to my car. "Trevor's ego is going to shatter when he realizes he has lost everything. Calvin is going to lose his mind when he realizes I own his house. I need absolute physical control of the perimeter." Vivian was already 2 steps ahead. "I contracted a private security firm this morning," she said. 6 former military operatives. They will be dressed in high-end formal wear, blending in as private corporate detail. They will secure the front entrance, the rear patio, and the main conference room. If anyone tries to escalate the situation physically, they will shut it down immediately. "What about our transportation?" I asked. "I secured a black Maybach limousine," Vivian replied. "The driver will pick you and Jamal up at exactly 9:30. You will arrive at the estate at 10 o'clock. That gives Trevor enough time to get a few drinks in him and start bragging to the crowd. It will maximize the impact of your arrival." I smiled, letting the cold satisfaction settle in my chest. "Perfect. I will see you tonight, Vivian." The rest of the day moved with agonizing slowness. I spent the late afternoon having my hair and makeup done by professionals. I watched myself transform in the mirror. The exhausted, overworked travel nurse vanished completely. The woman staring back at me was the chief executive officer of a $30 million empire. She had sharp eyes, a flawless crimson mouth, and the absolute certainty of a predator who held all the winning cards. I dressed Jamal in a perfectly tailored tuxedo I had bought him that afternoon. He looked so handsome, so grown up. He adjusted his bow tie in the mirror and gave me a confident smile. He did not know the details of the corporate war I was waging, but he knew his mother was no longer afraid. At 9:30, the black Maybach slid silently up to the curb outside our apartment building. The driver stepped out in a crisp uniform and opened the door for us. I helped Jamal into the plush leather interior and slid in beside him. The emerald gown pooled around my feet. I looked out the tinted windows as we pulled away from the modest neighborhood, heading toward the wealthy gated community where my family lived. It was 10 o'clock on New Year's Eve when we turned onto the main road leading to the Adams estate. Even from a mile away, the sky was glowing with the massive light display Trevor had rented. When we pulled up to the wrought iron gates, the sheer scale of their financial delusion became visible. The driveway was lined with imported ice sculptures and flaming braziers. A fleet of luxury cars was parked haphazardly along the manicured lawn. The entire facade of the grand brick mansion was illuminated by colored spotlights. Through the massive bay windows, I could see hundreds of people packed into the formal living and dining rooms. Waiters in crisp white uniforms were circulating with silver trays of champagne and expensive caviar. A live jazz band was playing loudly from a heated glass tent erected in the backyard. They were burning through money like it was oxygen. They had mortgaged this very property 3 times over to pay for this ridiculous spectacle. The Maybach rolled smoothly up the winding driveway, bypassing the line of guests waiting for the valet. My private security detail was already in place. I could see 2 tall, broad-shouldered men in dark suits standing near the heavy oak front doors, watching the crowd with trained professional eyes. Inside the house, the atmosphere was electric with unearned arrogance. I could hear the muted roar of conversation and the clinking of crystal glasses. Through the large window near the front entrance, I caught sight of Trevor. He was standing on the grand sweeping staircase holding a microphone. He was wearing a white tuxedo jacket looking like a cartoon version of a billionaire playboy. Bianca was clinging to his arm draped in a sparkling gold dress, her face glowing with smug superiority. My father Calvin was standing at the bottom of the stairs surrounded by the senior elders of the church and a group of wealthy local businessmen. He was puffing on a cigar, nodding proudly as Trevor spoke. I rolled down the tinted window just an inch to hear Trevor's amplified voice drifting out into the cold night air. "We are gathered here tonight to celebrate the dawn of a new era," Trevor announced, his voice dripping with supreme confidence. "The Adams family has always been a pillar of this community, but tonight we are taking our vision to a global scale. We are on the verge of finalizing a monumental partnership with Apex Medical. A partnership that will revolutionize healthcare and solidify our legacy forever." A round of enthusiastic applause erupted from the crowd. Calvin raised his glass of scotch in a proud toast. Bianca smiled radiantly, soaking in the envious stares of her church friends. "We are expecting the chief executive officer of Apex to arrive shortly," Trevor continued, leaning into the microphone. "And I want to personally thank all of you for being here to witness the moment this family reaches the absolute pinnacle of success." The crowd cheered again, drowning out the jazz band. They were completely captivated by the illusion. They thought they were standing in the home of a tech visionary. They thought they were drinking the wine of a conquering king. I reached out and placed my hand on the heavy door handle of the Maybach. I looked down at the emerald silk of my $10,000 gown and felt the cool weight of the diamond choker against my skin. I looked at Jamal, who was watching me with wide, curious eyes. "Are you ready?" I asked him, my voice perfectly calm. He nodded, sitting up straight. "I am ready, Mom." The driver stepped out of the vehicle and walked around to my side. He pulled the heavy door open, letting the freezing winter air rush into the warm cabin. The bright security lights from the driveway reflected off the polished black paint of the limousine. I stepped out of the Maybach, my emerald heels hitting the frozen pavement with a sharp, definitive click. The sweeping train of my gown dragged across the stone, commanding the space around me. The 2 security operatives at the front door immediately stepped forward, parting the crowd of lingering guests to clear a direct path for me. The murmurs in the driveway suddenly stopped. People turned to stare, trying to figure out who the woman in the emerald gown was. They did not recognize the exhausted nurse who used to sit in the back pew of the church. They did not recognize the struggling single mother who drove the beat-up Honda Civic. I took Jamal's hand and walked up the front steps of my own house. The heavy oak doors stood wide open, pouring warm yellow light out into the cold night. Trevor was still standing on the staircase laughing at a joke one of the church elders had just made. Bianca was holding her champagne glass ready to toast her impending victory. I stepped across the threshold and walked directly into the grand foyer. The security operatives flanked me, stepping inside and silently closing the massive front doors behind us. The heavy thud of the doors shutting echoed through the marble entryway. The trap was closed, the paper was signed, the debt was mine, it was time to collect. I walked past the designated coat check room without even turning my head. The teenage girl hired to take the jackets stared at my emerald gown with her mouth slightly open. I did not stop. Vivian fell into step on my right, her briefcase held tightly against her side. The two security operatives walked a half step behind us, creating an impenetrable wall of authority. We moved directly toward the main ballroom, where the jazz band was playing a lively tune. The sheer volume of wealth packed into my family home was sickening. I saw women in designer diamonds and men in tailored tuxedos laughing, holding crystal champagne flutes. They were completely oblivious to the fact that the very floor they were standing on was legally mine. As I entered the massive room, the conversations nearest to the door began to die down. Heads turned, people stopped talking. The silence spread through the ballroom like a wave, until the only sound was the jazz band playing in the tent outside. I stood at the edge of the sunken living room letting them look. I wanted them to see the woman they had cast out. I wanted them to see the exhausted travel nurse they thought they had ruined. But instead of a defeated victim, they saw a billionaire. The emerald silk of my custom gown caught the ambient light, making me look like royalty. It took exactly 10 seconds for my family to realize who had just ruined their perfect party. My mother Brenda was the first to react. She dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor, but no one moved to clean it up. Her face turned an ugly shade of red as she marched across the room, her heels stomping aggressively. Calvin was right behind her, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might snap. Bianca followed them, dragging Trevor by the arm. "Desiree Adams," my mother hissed, stopping a few feet away from my security detail. "What in the world do you think you are doing here? I told you to use the service entrance." Calvin stepped forward, puffing his chest out to assert his patriarchal dominance. "You have lost your mind, Desiree," he growled, his voice vibrating with absolute fury. "You come into my house dressed like some cheap socialite when you do not even have a job. You are a disgrace to this family. Get out before I call the police." I did not flinch. I did not move. I just looked at him with profound pity. Trevor pushed his way to the front of the group, adjusting his white tuxedo jacket. He looked me up and down and let out a loud, mocking laugh. He turned to the crowd of guests who were watching the drama unfold with wide eyes. "Look at this," he announced, projecting his voice so everyone could hear. The fired nurse decided to play dress-up. "Did you rent that gown, Desiree? Did you max out your last credit card just to come here and pretend you belong in our world? You are pathetic." He turned to my security detail. "You men work for the event company, right? Throw this fired nurse out immediately. She is trespassing on private property." The two operatives did not even blink. They remained perfectly still, their eyes fixed straight ahead. Trevor frowned, his face flushing with embarrassment when his orders were ignored. "I said remove her," he snapped, his voice pitching higher. "They do not work for the event company, Trevor." I said, my voice perfectly calm and carrying across the quiet room. "They work for me, and they are not going anywhere." Bianca crossed her arms and glared at me. "You are completely delusional, Desiree. You do not have security. You do not have anything. You are a broke, suspended nurse who cannot even afford to feed her own child. Now leave before you ruin the most important night of our lives." "We are expecting the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Medical any minute now, and we will not let you embarrass us in front of a billionaire." I turned my gaze away from Bianca and looked directly at Trevor. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. True power does not have to shout. You talk a lot about this $2 million investment, Trevor, I said slowly. You invited all these important people here to celebrate your genius, but we both know your technology startup is a complete fraud. Trevor's face went completely white. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd of investors and church elders standing nearby. Calvin pointed a trembling finger at me. How dare you slander him in my house? It is not slander if it is true. Calvin, I replied. I nodded slightly to Vivian, who stepped forward from my right side. She opened her leather briefcase and pulled out a thick red folder. She did not hand it to Calvin. She walked straight up to Trevor and shoved it hard against his chest, forcing him to grab it or let it drop. What is this? Trevor stammered, fumbling with the heavy file. That is a formal notification from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Vivian said, her voice ringing out with crystal-clear legal authority. It details the stolen intellectual property you used to build your fraudulent pitch deck. The code you claimed was proprietary belongs to a defunct company in California. You stole it. Furthermore, the financial projections and letters of intent you submitted to Apex Medical Holdings are completely fabricated. That constitutes federal wire fraud. The entire ballroom erupted into shocked whispers. The church elders who had condemned me just days ago were now staring at Trevor with open disgust. The local businessmen who had been considering investing their own money were backing away from him like he had a contagious disease. Trevor opened the folder, his hands shaking violently. He scanned the first page and his eyes widened in sheer terror. He looked desperately at Bianca and then at Calvin, trying to find a way to spin the narrative. He was watching his entire imaginary empire crumble in real time. This is fake! Trevor shouted, his voice cracking as he threw the folder onto the floor. This is a setup! Desiree fabricated all of this because she is jealous. You cannot do this to me. You do not work for Apex. You are just a bitter, unemployed nurse. He turned to the crowd, a wild, desperate look in his eyes. Do not listen to her, he pleaded. The chief executive officer of Apex is arriving any minute. She is bringing the term sheet to sign my check tonight. Once she gets here, she will have this crazy woman arrested for corporate espionage. I watched him flail. I watched the absolute panic consume him as he realized his lies were catching up to him. I reached out and took a glass of sparkling champagne from a passing waiter who was frozen in shock. I held the crystal flute in my hand and let a slow, cold smile touch my lips. Oh, Trevor, I said, taking a small sip of the champagne. She is already here. The silence in the grand foyer was absolute. I handed my champagne glass back to the frozen waiter and walked past my trembling brother. I stepped up the grand staircase and took the microphone directly from Trevor's loose grip. He was too shocked to even resist. I turned to face the sea of wealthy investors, church elders, and local socialites. They were staring at me in my custom emerald gown, completely captivated by the unfolding drama. Good evening, everyone, I said, my voice echoing cleanly through the massive speakers. Allow me to introduce myself properly. My name is Desiree Adams. I am the founder and chief executive officer of Apex Medical. The collective gasp from the crowd sounded like all the oxygen being sucked from the room. Calvin staggered backward, gripping the banister as if his legs had suddenly given out. Brenda covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with sheer, unfiltered horror. Trevor just stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He looked from me to Vivian, and then down at the red folder in his hands as reality finally crashed into his delusional world. I nodded to Vivian, who was standing by the media console. She tapped a single key on her tablet. The massive digital screens that Trevor had rented to display his fake company logo suddenly flickered. They were instantly replaced by high-resolution scans of internal financial documents, bank statements, and forged wire transfers. The evidence was 50 feet wide and glowing for the entire elite of the city to witness. You are all invited here tonight to celebrate a massive corporate acquisition. I continued pacing slowly across the landing, looking down at the sea of faces. But what you are actually witnessing is a federal crime in progress. The man standing behind me, Trevor Adams, submitted a fraudulent pitch deck to my company. He used stolen intellectual property and fabricated revenue reports to solicit a $2 million investment from Apex. He thought he was outsmarting a faceless corporation. He did not know he was trying to scam his own sister. I pointed to the screen behind me where a blown-up bank statement was displayed. And this is how he funded this ridiculous party. My mother, Brenda Adams, illegally drained $45,000 from my teenage son's college fund. She funneled that money directly into Trevor's failing business account so he could lease luxury cars and pretend to be a successful tech mogul. She stole from her own grandson to prop up a lie. The church elders began murmuring among themselves, looking at my parents with absolute disgust. Women who had praised Brenda for her religious devotion were now stepping away from her as if she were toxic. The local businessmen who had been considering investing their own money were furiously whispering to their wives and grabbing their coats. "And Calvin," I said, turning my cold gaze to my father, "you mortgaged your standing in the church and your reputation in this community to back a scam. You stood on this very staircase and lied to your friends, your congregation, and your investors just to satisfy your own vanity. You tried to destroy my nursing career because I refused to be a pawn in your pathetic scheme. You thought stripping me of my license would force me to crawl back here and beg." Calvin opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The great patriarch was completely broken, his authority entirely stripped away in front of the very people he worshipped. Bianca suddenly shoved her way past my parents, her face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate rage. She was shaking so badly her gold dress shimmered erratically under the chandeliers. She pointed a finger at me, her chest heaving. "You are lying!" Bianca screamed, her voice shrill and echoing through the silent ballroom. "This is a setup. You do not own anything. This is our house. We are rich. We are going to be multimillionaires. You are just a jealous fired nurse trying to ruin our special night." I looked at her with nothing but profound pity. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to destroy her completely. I reached into the hidden pocket of my gown and pulled out a thick stack of folded papers. "Actually, Bianca," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterics like a knife, "you defaulted on all 3 of your mortgages 3 months ago. You have not made a single payment on those leased cars in half a year. The bank was preparing to seize all your assets yesterday morning. You have absolutely zero equity to your name." I held up the legal documents so the entire room could see the heavy red stamps across the top pages. "But Apex Holdings bought your debt yesterday afternoon." I continued, tossing the papers so they fluttered down the stairs and landed right at Bianca's feet. "I bought the primary mortgage. I bought the secondary loans. I bought the credit lines you maxed out to buy that dress you are wearing. I am your sole creditor. And since you are in massive default, I accelerated the collection process. I own this mansion. I own Trevor's leased cars. I own the furniture you are sitting on. I own absolutely everything." The silence that followed was heavy and final. The illusion was completely shattered. Trevor fell to his knees on the carpet, clutching his chest, as if he could not breathe. He was weeping openly, the sound echoing pathetically over the speakers. Calvin looked like he had aged 20 years in a matter of seconds, slumping against the wall. Brenda tried to reach out to me, her face pleading, but my security operatives stepped forward, blocking her path instantly. "Desiree, please, Brenda," sobbed, her pious tone completely gone, replaced by sheer terror. "We are your family. We can fix this. You cannot throw your own mother out on the street." "You threw my son out first," I replied, my voice devoid of any emotion. "You tried to send me to a federal prison. Family protects each other, Brenda. You are just parasites." The people they had tried to impress were already walking toward the door, disgusted by the sheer magnitude of their fraud. The grand gala was turning into an absolute exodus of the elite. No one wanted to be associated with a criminal enterprise. I looked down at the expensive gold watch on my wrist. "It is exactly 11:45, I announced, projecting my voice to the furthest corners of the room. "You have exactly 15 minutes to pack whatever fits in a standard black trash bag and get off my property. When the clock strikes midnight, my security team will forcibly remove anyone who remains inside this house." Trevor looked up at me, his face streaked with sweat and fear as Bianca clung to him. "Desiree, please," he begged, his voice pathetic and broken. "You cannot do this to us. Where are we supposed to go?" I looked down at the man who had tried to ruin my entire life. I felt absolutely nothing for him. You are not going anywhere, Trevor, I said, my voice turning to absolute ice. The police are waiting at the bottom of the driveway right now. They have a federal warrant for your arrest regarding the wire fraud. You are going to prison. The rest of you have 14 minutes left. I suggest you start packing. I handed the microphone to Vivian and walked down the stairs. The remaining guests parted from me like the Red Sea. I took Jamal's hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. I walked past the imported ice sculptures and the flaming braziers, leaving my broken family behind me to face the ruins of their own creation. The reign of the Addams family was officially over. I had burned their kingdom to the ground, and I was leaving with the ashes. I walked down the grand stone steps of the mansion, feeling the crisp winter air against my face. Behind me, the beautiful illusion was tearing itself apart entirely. The remaining guests were practically running for their cars, eager to escape the heavy taint of federal fraud. The flashing red and blue lights of 3 police cruisers illuminated the manicured lawn, casting harsh shadows across the imported ice sculptures. They were melting now, dripping slowly onto the frozen pavement. 2 federal agents marched up the driveway, pushing past the fleeing socialites. I stood by the open door of the Maybach and watched as they entered the grand foyer. Less than a minute later, they dragged Trevor out into the cold night. His white tuxedo jacket was rumpled, and his face was entirely drained of color. He was hyperventilating, stumbling over his own feet, as the agents forced his hands behind his back and locked the cold steel cuffs around his wrists. He looked so incredibly small. The arrogant tech visionary was gone, entirely replaced by a terrified little boy, realizing he was about to lose his freedom. Bianca followed them out, screaming hysterically, trying to pull on the agent's arms, but a local police officer stepped in and pushed her back firmly. My private security team moved through the house with absolute precision. They did not raise their voices, and they did not use excessive force, but their physical presence was undeniable. They herded Calvin, Brenda, and Bianca toward the front doors. They had not even bothered to pack trash bags. They were in too much shock to gather their belongings. Calvin was clutching his chest, his face purple with indignation and fear. Brenda was sobbing uncontrollably, her expensive makeup running down her face in dark, thick streaks. Bianca was shivering in her thin gold dress, her arms wrapped around herself as the freezing wind hit her bare skin. The security operative stepped back and pulled the heavy oak doors shut. The sound of the lock clicking echoed loudly across the driveway. It started to rain, a freezing winter drizzle that cut right through their expensive clothes. They were standing on the wet pavement, completely locked out of the life they thought they owned forever. Brenda saw me standing by the Maybach. She broke away from Calvin and ran toward me, her heels slipping on the wet stone. She threw herself onto the cold ground right at my feet. The damp pavement soaked instantly into her designer dress, but she did not care. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my emerald gown, crying real agonizing tears. "Desiree, my baby, please," she wailed, her voice breaking over the sound of the rain. "Please, you cannot do this. We are your blood. We are your family. We love you. You cannot leave your own mother homeless in the freezing cold. Please, Desiree, have mercy." I looked down at the woman who had given birth to me. I looked at the woman who had watched me struggle, who had helped steal my son's future, who had told me my suffering was divine punishment. I felt no anger anymore. I felt absolutely nothing at all. I gently pulled the heavy silk fabric of my gown out of her desperate grip. "When Jamal was freezing on Christmas, you said there was no room at the table," I said, my voice perfectly steady and clear. "You told me I was a failure, and that I deserved to be cast out. Tonight there is no room for you in my life." I turned away from her and got into the back seat of the Maybach, where Jamal was waiting. I nodded to the driver. He put the car in gear, and we rolled slowly down the winding driveway. I looked out the tinted window one last time. I watched my private security team pull the towering wrought iron gates shut and engage the heavy locks. Calvin, Brenda, and Bianca were left standing in the freezing rain on the wrong side of the fence, watching my taillights disappear into the dark. The world moves incredibly fast when you are no longer weighed down by toxic anchors. 3 months passed, and the dust from the Addams family explosion finally settled. The universe has a beautiful way of balancing the scales, and karma came for my family with absolute ruthless precision. Trevor was denied bail. The federal prosecutors found even more evidence of wire fraud and forged documents on his personal computers. He was quickly tried and transferred to a federal penitentiary. The arrogant boy who used to smoke expensive cigars and pretend to be a Silicon Valley genius was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He spent his days mopping cafeteria floors and sleeping on a thin cot in a cell that was smaller than the coat closet he had tried to banish me to. His fake empire had bought him nothing but a decade behind bars. Bianca had thought she was untouchable, but the staggering legal debts from Trevor's defense drained whatever hidden cash she had stashed away. With the mansion foreclosed and the luxury cars repossessed, she had to face the reality of actual physical labor. She applied for dozens of high-end retail jobs, but her reputation in the city was completely ruined. Everyone knew her as the wife of a convicted fraudster. Desperate to pay her mounting legal bills and avoid going to jail herself, she finally took the only job that would hire her. She worked the overnight shift at a 24-hour fast food chain. The woman who had tried to pay me $100 to serve appetizers to her wealthy friends now spent her nights wearing a polyester uniform, smelling permanently of old grease and sweeping up spilled French fries. Calvin and Brenda suffered a fall from grace that was absolute and permanent. The church elders who had witnessed their spectacular public humiliation immediately ousted Calvin from his position on the board. He was stripped of all his titles and his influence within the congregation. The community they had so desperately tried to impress completely turned their backs on them, ignoring their phone calls and crossing the street when they saw them coming. Without the mansion, without their status, and without the illusion of wealth, they had absolutely nothing left to hide behind. They were forced to move into a tiny, cramped one-bedroom apartment on the very outskirts of the city. They spent their days arguing bitterly with each other, surrounded by cheap furniture, living the exact life of poverty and struggle they had always mocked me for. They had built their entire identity on looking down at others, and now they were at the absolute bottom. I did not think about them very often anymore. My mind was focused entirely on the beautiful life I was building. I sat back against the plush leather seat of the first-class cabin, listening to the low, steady hum of the jet engines as we cruised at 40,000 feet. The flight attendant walked by and handed me a warm, scented towel and a fresh glass of sparkling water. I looked out the oval window at the endless expanse of blue sky stretching out toward Europe. We were flying to Paris for a real vacation. I turned my head and looked at Jamal sitting in the oversized luxury seat next to me. He was wearing comfortable travel clothes and had a pair of expensive noise-canceling headphones resting around his neck. He was holding a glossy brochure for a prestigious engineering university, carefully reading through the academic programs they offered. His college fund had been entirely restored and multiplied by the success of Apex Medical. He did not have to worry about student loans or taking on extra shifts to pay for his textbooks. His entire future was an open door, and he had the absolute freedom to walk through it without fear. He looked up from the brochure and caught me watching him. He smiled a bright, genuine smile that filled my heart with absolute warmth and total peace. I smiled back and took a sip of my water, resting my head against the soft seat. For 34 years, I had let other people dictate my worth. I had let them make me feel small and insignificant. I had believed that family was defined by blood, even when that blood was entirely toxic. But I had finally learned the truth. Family is not about who you are born to. Family is about who protects you, who lifts you up, and who stands by you when the world goes dark. I had built a massive empire from nothing. I had fought a brutal war against my own bloodline, and I had won completely. The days of struggling and surviving were over forever. From now on, we were only going to thrive. The greatest lesson here is that blood does not always equal family. True family is built on mutual respect and protection. Desiree spent years trying to earn approval from people who only wanted to tear her down. Her journey teaches us that the ultimate act of self-care is walking away from toxicity even when it comes from your own parents or siblings. The best revenge is choosing your own peace and building a successful life on your own terms. Have you ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives to protect your peace? Tell us your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering videos.